I run a small boat repair shop out of a converted boathouse on the edge of Lake Cumberland, and the day Renata Cole showed up at my dock with one bag and no explanation, I had varnish on my hands and sawdust in my hair, and absolutely no idea. My life was about to shift underneath me like a hull taking on water. My name is Cole Whitfield. I bought the boathouse 2 years after my divorce was finalized, with money I had saved working 60-hour weeks at a marina outside of Bowling Green. The place needed everything. New wiring, patched roof, floor joists that felt like they were held together by memory and good intentions. I spent the first winter fixing it with my own hands. By spring it was livable, by the following summer it felt like mine. I had been married to Renata's older sister Diane for 6 years. We were not a bad match on paper. We met in our late 20s when we were both the kind of busy that feels like purpose, and for a while that energy held us together. Then it didn't. The divorce was not dramatic. It was quiet in a way that was somehow worse. Two people who had stopped finding reasons to come home early, who had started eating dinner at different times, who had one afternoon simply sat across from each other and said the thing neither of them had said out loud yet. I kept the dog for a year until he passed. Diane kept the apartment. We divided the rest without much argument. I had not seen or spoken to Diane's family since the papers were signed. Renata was 3 years younger than her sister and had always been, from what I remembered, the kind of person who made other people feel at ease without appearing to try. She taught high school English in Lexington. She had gotten engaged the previous October to a man named Fletcher, who worked in commercial real estate and had, from what I gathered through the thin thread of mutual acquaintances, a very firm handshake and a habit of talking about square footage at dinner parties. I did not know her well. We had been friendly at family gatherings, in the way that people are friendly when they are fond of someone, but have no reason to seek them out on their own. So when she appeared at the end of my dock on a Thursday afternoon in late April, with a canvas duffel bag over one shoulder and her car keys still in her hand, I did not immediately understand what I was looking at. I set down the brush I was using on a 40-year-old runabout I was restoring for a man in Somerset and wiped my hands on a rag. I walked to the end of the dock. The water was gray and flat. There were clouds pulling in from the west. She said, I didn't know where else to go. I looked at her for a moment. She looked tired in the way that comes not from one bad night but from several weeks of not sleeping well. Her eyes were steady though. She was not crying. She was not asking for permission exactly. She was stating a fact. I said, okay. I picked up her bag and carried it inside. She had broken off the engagement 5 days earlier. She told me this over coffee at the kitchen table while rain started against the windows. Fletcher had not cheated, she said. He had not done anything overtly wrong. She had woken up one morning 3 weeks before their scheduled engagement photos and understood, with a clarity that frightened her, that she was not building a life. She was managing one. She had tried for another month to talk herself out of what she knew. She could not. She returned the ring on a Tuesday. He took it without much surprise, which told her something she did not want to think about too hard. She had gone to her parents' house in Frankfurt first, but her mother, with genuine love and the best of intentions, had immediately begun treating the situation like a crisis requiring a corrective plan, and Renata had lasted 4 days before she needed to be somewhere quieter. Her friends in Lexington were kind, but kept asking what she was going to do next, and she did not have an answer, and the asking made the not knowing feel like a failure instead of just a fact. She said, I remembered you had bought a place out here. Someone mentioned it. I hope that's not strange. I said it wasn't. She looked out the window at the lake. You built all of this yourself? I told her most of it. Some of it I'd had help with. She nodded like that answered something she hadn't asked. I showed her the spare room. It had a window that faced east and caught the morning light, and I had put a quilt on the bed that my grandmother had made, mostly because it was the only quilt I owned. She stood in the doorway for a moment. She said, I'm not going to be any trouble. I told her I didn't think she would be. The first few days she slept a lot, not in a worrying way, more like someone who had been running on borrowed alertness for so long that her body was finally collecting what it was owed. She would come out in the mornings looking more like herself than the day before. I worked in the boathouse during the days. She would sometimes sit on the dock with a paperback and a mug of tea. She didn't talk much and neither did I, and the quiet between us was not uncomfortable. It was the kind of quiet that has texture to it, a presence, rather than an absence. On the 4th day she appeared in the doorway of the boathouse while I was fitting a new transom board on the runabout. She said, "Can I watch?" I said, "Sure." She sat on an overturned cooler near the wall and watched me work for about 40 minutes without saying anything. At some point she asked what kind of wood I was using. I told her white oak because it holds up against fresh water and doesn't swell the way some other woods do. She asked how I learned to do this. I told her I'd worked around boats since I was 17, and eventually the knowledge just accumulates whether you mean it to or not. She said, "I think that's what happened to me with teaching. One day I just knew things I didn't know I'd learned." I kept working. After a while she went back inside and came out 20 minutes later with a plate of sandwiches and set them on the workbench without comment. They were good sandwiches, sharp provolone, and a little mustard on sourdough. I did not say anything about it. She went back to her cooler. We ate in the same general direction without making a ceremony of it. I thought about that later after she had gone inside. The ease of it. How rarely that happened with another person. Diane called on a Saturday morning. I was outside splitting wood when my phone buzzed on the porch railing. I saw the name and stood there for a moment before answering. She said she had heard from their mother that Renata was staying with me. I said that was right. There was a pause. Diane said, "Cole, I don't think that's a great idea." I asked her why. She said it was just complicated. She used the word complicated twice. She said Renata was going through something and probably needed to be around family. And she wasn't sure that a place like mine, out on the lake, alone, was the right environment for someone who needed support. I said Renata had come on her own and seemed to be doing fine. Another pause. Then Diane said, "She doesn't actually know you, Cole." I said I wasn't sure that was entirely true. The call lasted about 4 more minutes. Diane said she might drive down to check on her sister. I said Renata was welcome to make whatever choices she wanted. We hung up and I went back to splitting wood, and I did not tell Renata about the call. That was a mistake. I understood that later. What I noticed about Renata over those first 2 weeks was this. She was paying attention, not in a way that felt intrusive, but she noticed things. She noticed when I came in from the boathouse with a knot in my shoulder, and the next morning there was a bottle of ibuprofen on the kitchen counter that had not been there before. She noticed that I drank my coffee before it was done brewing and started making the pot a few minutes earlier. She noticed that I had a small shelf of paperbacks near the back window, and one afternoon, without asking, she began organizing them in a way that made more sense than what I had done. And when I asked how she arranged them, she said, simply, "The ones you've reread are on the left." I asked how she could tell which ones those were. She said the spines. I looked at the shelf. She was right. One afternoon she was helping me sort through a bin of old marine hardware, cleats and turnbuckles and snatch blocks that a customer had offloaded from an estate sale, and without looking up she said, "Have you ever wondered why I left Diane's wedding early?" I stopped what I was doing. She was still looking at the hardware in her hands, turning a bronze cleat over slowly. I said I had not known she'd left early. She said she had. About an hour before the reception ended, she told their mother she had a headache. She drove home to Lexington and sat in her car in her own driveway for 20 minutes before going inside. She put the cleat down. She said, "I'm not telling you why. Not yet. I just wanted you to know it happened." I did not ask. I went back to sorting hardware. But I thought about it for 3 days. Diane arrived on a Wednesday afternoon in the 3rd week. I heard a car on the gravel and came around the side of the boathouse to see her getting out of a gray rental. She had flown into Nashville the night before, apparently, and driven up. She looked the way Diane always looked, put together, purposeful, carrying the particular energy of someone who has decided in advance how a situation is going to go. She hugged me briefly and said I looked thin. I said I was the same weight I'd been for 12 years. She went inside. I stayed in the boathouse for another 10 minutes before following. When I came in, they were sitting at the kitchen table. Renata had her hands around her mug. Diane was talking. The tone was not unkind, but it had the shape of a plan. I caught the words "come home" and "time to figure out next steps," and this was a good break. But Renata looked up when I came in. She did not look distressed. She looked, if anything, tired of the conversation she was already in. Diane glanced at me and said, "We were just talking about Ren coming back to Frankfurt for a while. Mom and Dad would love to have her, and there's more of a support system there." Renata said, "I don't need a support system. I'm fine." Diane said, "You're staying in your ex-brother-in-law's boathouse, Ren." Renata looked at her steadily. "I know where I am." The conversation went around that same circle 2 more times. Diane was not cruel about it. She was trying, in the way that oldest siblings often try, to organize a situation that she found unruly. Eventually she ran out of circles and sat back, and said she was going to drive into the nearest town for dinner, and if Renata wanted to come she was welcome. Renata said she'd stay. Diane looked at me before she left. I couldn't read what the look meant exactly, but there was something in it that was less accusatory than I expected. Something closer to resignation. She left. We listened to the rental car on the gravel. Renata said, "You didn't tell me," she called. I set down the glass of water I was holding. She said, "I'm not angry, I just need you to not do that again. Okay?" I said okay. I said I was sorry. She looked at me for a moment, then nodded and went back to her book. That night the weather came in hard off the lake. The kind of storm that shakes the windows in their frames and makes you glad you're somewhere solid. We sat on the covered back porch and watched the rain come down in sheets. The light was low. There was a candle on the table between us because the power had flickered twice. She asked me about the divorce, not in a prying way. She said, "You don't have to answer, but I've been wondering, what did you miss most after?" I thought about it. I said, "The weight of another person in the house. Not necessarily Diane specifically, just knowing someone else was there." She was quiet. I said, "What about you? What do you miss about Fletcher?" She didn't answer right away. Then she said, "I don't think I miss him the way I expected to. I miss the idea of being done deciding. Does that make sense? Like, I miss thinking the decision had been made." I said I thought I understood that. The rain kept coming down. The candle moved in a draft somewhere. She said, "I used to think about you. After the divorce, I mean." Not, she paused, choosing something. Not romantically, just whether you were okay. Diane didn't talk about it and I didn't ask, but I thought about it sometimes. Whether you had found somewhere to land. I looked at her. She was watching the rain. I said, "Did you?" She said, "I'm here, aren't I?" I didn't say anything to that. I didn't know what to say. We sat there for another hour, while the storm moved east, and then we went inside, and I lay awake for a long time, looking at the ceiling of my room and listening to the house settle around us. The next 2 weeks changed something, though I would have been hard-pressed to name it precisely while it was happening. She started helping me in the boathouse in the mornings. I was working on 2 projects by then, the runabout for the man in Somerset, and a small aluminum fishing boat that needed its hull re-riveted after someone had stored it badly for a decade. She was not a boatwoman, had never been, but she learned quickly and did not pretend to know things she didn't know, which is rarer than people think. I showed her how to clean a carburetor. She did it correctly on the second try. She showed me that same evening how to fold a fitted sheet in a way that actually worked. I had been doing it wrong for 43 years. On a Thursday morning, she drove into town by herself for the first time since she'd arrived. She came back with 2 bags of groceries and a small succulent in a clay pot that she set on the windowsill above the kitchen sink without explanation. The following week she told me she had been in contact with a school in Russell County, about 40 minutes north. They were looking for someone to teach junior AP English in the fall. She had applied the previous day. She said it carefully, watching my face as if she was not sure how I would take it. I said I thought that was a good thing. She said, "It would mean staying in the area, at least for a year." I said, "I know." She looked at me long enough that I felt it, and then she turned back to whatever she was cutting on the cutting board. That night I stood in the doorway of the boathouse after she had gone to bed, listening to the water against the pilings, and I thought about the way she had looked at me that afternoon, when she said staying in the area. I thought about the spines of the paperbacks. I thought about the way she had said, "I'm here, aren't I?" during the storm. I thought about the fact that I had not felt like my house was too big in 4 weeks. I almost did not say anything. That is probably the truest thing I can tell you. I am not a person who speaks before I am certain, and I am rarely certain about anything that matters. I had spent 2 years living alone and telling myself I preferred it, which was not entirely a lie but was not entirely the truth either, and Renata was not a thing to be uncertain about. She was not a problem to be solved or a situation to be managed. She was a person who had shown up at the end of my dock with 1 bag and no explanation, and had proceeded to leave fingerprints on everything. The spice rack reorganized. The east-facing windowsill with its small clay pot. The shelf of paperbacks arranged by hands that had been paying attention. She was going to leave. That was the shape I kept coming back to. The school in Russell County was 40 minutes away, not across town. She would find an apartment. She would build a life that was hers. And whatever this had been, Two people being kind to each other in a quiet place while they both figured something out would become a thing we refer to obliquely at holidays, if we referred to it at all. I did not want that. I did not entirely know what I wanted instead, but I knew what I didn't want, and sometimes that's where you start. She was on the porch one evening with a book she wasn't reading. I could tell by the way her eyes weren't moving. The sun was going down behind the tree line across the water, and the light was the particular shade of amber that only happens in the last 20 minutes before it's gone. I sat down across from her. She looked up. I said, "I want to say something and I need you to just let me get through it before you respond." She closed the book. I said, "I don't know what the right word is for what this has been. I'm not sure there is one. But you've been here for 7 weeks and I have not once wished it was different. Not the noise of another person in the house, not the way you reorganize things." She made a small sound that might have been the beginning of a laugh. And I kept going. "Not any of it. And I'm aware of who you are to me, technically, and I'm aware of what that looks like from the outside. I am not asking you for anything. I am just telling you that when you go, and I know you're going to build something new, and it's going to be good. I'm going to miss this. I wanted you to know that before it was the kind of thing that could only be said in past tense." She was looking at me steadily. The light on the water changed. She said, "Cole." I said, "Yeah." She said, "How long have you been sitting on that?" I said, "A while." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I told you about leaving the wedding because I needed you to know. Not someday then." She paused. "I left because I was standing in the back of that reception hall, watching my sister dance with someone I already knew was wrong for her, and you were standing near the bar by yourself, looking like you were trying to find the version of the night where you didn't have to be there, and I thought—" She stopped. "I waited," she said. "I thought, that's the person, that's the one who knows exactly how I feel right now." The sun finished going down. Neither of us moved to turn on a light. I reached across the table and put my hand over hers on the closure of the book. She turned her hand over. We sat there as the dark came in off the lake, and the frogs started up along the bank, and the first star appeared above the tree line, and neither of us said anything else for a long time because nothing else needed saying. She got the job in Russell County. She started in September. For about 6 weeks she drove back and forth, and I kept the key on the hook by the door and her coffee mug on the left side of the cabinet, which is where she'd put it the first week and where it had stayed. In October she stopped talking about the apartment she'd been looking at in Jamestown. Neither of us made an announcement about this. It was simply one of those things that becomes true before either person decides it. The following May, on a Saturday morning when the lake was very still, and there was not yet enough heat in the air to make the day heavy, we drove to the county clerk's office in a town neither of us had any particular attachment to and signed the papers in front of a woman named Martha who had a kind face and a coffee stain on her sleeve, and who seemed genuinely pleased to be there. We went to breakfast afterward at a diner near the highway. She got eggs. I got pancakes. We split the hash browns. That winter, Diane sent a card. It arrived in December addressed to both of us. Inside she had written, in her precise slanted handwriting, "I'm not sure I understood it at the time. I think I do now. I hope you're both happy." She had signed it just her name, no qualifier, no explanation, and I thought that was probably the most honest thing she could have done. Our daughter was born the following August, 9 days early, and loudly opinionated about it, which her mother said was not a surprise. We named her June because it was the month I had first thought, standing in the boathouse listening to water against the pilings, that I did not want Renata to go. She is 3 years old now. She has her mother's eyes and her mother's habit of paying attention, and she has already reorganized the lower kitchen cabinet twice in a way that somehow makes more sense than what was there before. Some mornings I come in from the boathouse, and Renata is at the kitchen window with her coffee, watching June in the yard, and she doesn't hear me come in, and I stand in the doorway for a moment before I say anything. I knew, the second she turned around at the end of that dock, with one bag over her shoulder and no explanation. I just needed the rest of the story to catch up to what I already knew.